4 days, 3 strikes, nearly 1,000 kilometers from Ukraine's border. In the final week of March 2026, Ukrainian drones reached the Leningrad region not once, but 3 consecutive times. Their targets were not frontline positions. They were Primorsk, one of Russia's principal oil export terminals on the Baltic Sea, Ust-Luga, a major energy hub processing billions of cubic meters of natural gas annually, and the KF refinery, among the largest oil processing facilities in the country. Each strike was confirmed not by Ukrainian sources, but by Russia's own regional governor, Alexander Drozdenko, who acknowledged damage at industrial sites across 3 separate nights. Russia's air defense systems, positioned across one of the most fortified corridors in Europe, intercepted dozens of drones, and still enough got through. Let that sink in for a moment. The question is not how Ukraine did this. The question is what it reveals about who is actually winning the war of attrition. Most coverage of this story stopped at the explosions. They showed you the satellite imagery. They showed you the fires. They told you Ukraine hit Russia deep inside its own territory. And then they moved on to the next headline. That is not analysis. That is a highlight reel. In this video, I am going to give you something different. I am going to give you a strategic lens, the kind used by defense economists and geopolitical risk analysts to understand what these 4 days in late March 2026 actually mean beneath the surface. We are going to answer 3 questions that the headline coverage completely ignored. First, why energy infrastructure? Not the front line is increasingly where this war will be decided. Second, what Russia's own response reveals about a strategic vulnerability that Moscow cannot afford to admit publicly. Third, how a series of drone strikes nearly 1,000 kilometers away from your life has a direct transmission mechanism into your energy bills, your food prices, and the cost of capital in your economy. Before we go further, one ground rule. Every claim I make in this video is anchored to verifiable data official statements, confirmed reports, and documented patterns. When I move into strategic interpretation, I will tell you explicitly, you will always know the difference between a fact and an analytical inference. Because in a conflict this consequential, the difference between those 2 things matters enormously. Now, to understand why striking Primorsk, Ust-Luga, and the KF refinery in the same week represents something categorically different from previous Ukrainian operations, we need to look at the economic architecture of how Russia has been funding this war since 2022. And when you see the numbers, the logic of Ukraine's targeting becomes razor sharp. But there is one piece of context you need first, and it is the piece that changes everything. Let us build the evidentiary record precisely, methodically. On March 23, 2026, Ukrainian drones reached the port of Primorsk, located in Russia's Leningrad region on the Baltic Sea, approximately 900 to 1,000 kilometers from Ukrainian-controlled territory. Regional Governor Alexander Drozdenko officially confirmed that fuel storage infrastructure at the port had sustained damage and caught fire. In the days following the strike, open-source satellite imagery corroborated his statement, showing evidence consistent with a significant fire event at that location. Primorsk is not an ordinary port. It is the terminal endpoint of the Baltic pipeline system, one of Russia's primary arteries for crude oil export to global markets. According to publicly available energy infrastructure data, the facility holds significant storage capacity across multiple large-scale reservoirs. In 2025, the port exported approximately 17 million tons of petroleum products. That figure comes not from Ukrainian sources. It comes from energy market tracking data that has been cited by analysts monitoring Russian export flows since the beginning of the sanctions regime. 4 days later, 2 more strikes followed. On March 25th, Ukrainian drones reached Ust-Luga, also situated in the Leningrad region. Governor Drozdenko confirmed the attack for the 2nd time in 72 hours. The Ust-Luga terminal was subsequently sealed and taken offline for several days. According to energy infrastructure records, Ust-Luga processed approximately 33 million tons of cargo in 2025, including liquefied natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas. The facility is operated in part by Novatek, one of Russia's largest energy companies. 3 tankers and multiple storage units sustained reported damage, though independent verification of the precise damage figures remains limited, and those numbers should be treated as unconfirmed estimates rather than established fact. On March 26th, a third strike hit the KF refinery, also in the Leningrad region, in the vicinity of St. Petersburg. Governor Drozdenko confirmed for the third consecutive time that an industrial zone had been struck. He declined to specify the target. Social media documentation from local residents, cross-referenced with satellite imagery reviewed by open-source analysts, indicated fire activity consistent with fuel storage ignition at the refinery site. Now, here is where Russia's own official statements become analytically significant. Moscow claimed that Ukrainian drones could not have traveled through Russian airspace undetected over such a distance. Official Russian sources suggested the drones must have transited NATO territory, specifically Polish and Baltic airspace, before reaching the Leningrad region. That claim was officially and unambiguously rejected. Latvia's Ministry of Defense issued a formal statement on behalf of Estonia and Lithuania as well, stating that none of the 3 Baltic states were involved in planning or executing Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. The statement did not merely deny involvement, it characterized Russia's narrative as a deliberate misinformation campaign designed to divide NATO solidarity and undermine public trust in state institutions. And then there is the internal contradiction within Russia's own reporting. On March 23rd, Governor Drozdenko reported that Russian air defenses intercepted more than 50 Ukrainian drones over Russian territory. On March 25th, 33 additional drones were reportedly intercepted. On March 26th, 21 more. These interceptions were reported across regions stretching from central Russia toward the Leningrad area, tracing a corridor that runs directly through Russian-controlled airspace, not NATO territory. Open-source intelligence analysts tracking air alert activations across Russian regions on those 3 nights documented a sequential pattern alerts, activating region by region along a route consistent with drones traveling from Ukrainian-controlled territory northward through Russian airspace toward St. Petersburg. The internal contradiction is not subtle. Russia's own defense ministry confirmed shooting down drones over Russian regions on the same nights that Russian officials claimed those drones never flew over Russia. That is the evidentiary record. Confirmed sources, official statements, cross-referenced data. But here is what none of that evidence tells you on its own. Why these 3 targets in this specific region, in this specific week, represent a strategic calculation that goes far beyond what the explosions look like on camera. That calculation reveals something about the architecture of this war that most analysts have not yet fully articulated. Here is the question serious strategists are asking. Why Leningrad? Why not continue targeting the refineries and depots closer to the front? The ones in Rostov, in Krasnodar, in the regions Ukraine has been striking since 2023. Why expend the resources, the planning cycles, and the operational risk to push drones nearly 1,000 kilometers into one of the most densely monitored corridors in Russia? The answer requires understanding a principle that defense economists have documented across multiple prolonged conflicts. It is not the dramatic battlefield moment that ends a war of attrition. It is the slow compounding erosion of the financial architecture that sustains it. Think of it this way. The front line consumes resources, but the energy export infrastructure generates the revenue that replenishes those resources. Attack the front line and you slow the advance. Attack the revenue engine and you accelerate the financial exhaustion of the entire war machine. This is not a new concept. Analysts observing targeting patterns in conflicts from the Gulf War through the post-2000 campaigns have consistently noted that the most strategically decisive strikes are rarely the ones that make the most dramatic footage. They are the ones that interrupt cash flow. Ukraine appears to have internalized that principle at an operational level. Primorsk, and Ust-Luga are not simply ports. They are, according to energy market analysts who track Russian export flows, among the primary hard currency generators on Russia's Baltic coast. When those facilities go offline, even for days, not weeks, the volume of oil that cannot be loaded, shipped, and sold represents a direct subtraction from revenue that Russia needs to cover military salaries, procurement contracts, and weapons production costs that have escalated significantly since 2022. One analytical framework worth considering here, and I want to be precise that this is strategic interpretation, not confirmed intelligence, is that Ukraine may be pursuing a doctrine of threshold compression. The logic runs as follows. Russia's economy has demonstrated a degree of resilience under sanctions that surprised many Western analysts. Direct financial pressure from the outside has been absorbed. But internal disruption to the physical infrastructure of energy export is considerably harder to route around. You cannot sanction-proof a burning storage tank. If that interpretation is accurate, then the Leningrad strikes represent a deliberate escalation in targeting sophistication, moving from opportunistic infrastructure harassment to systematic pressure on Russia's highest value export nodes. There is a second dimension that deserves attention. Geographic signaling. The Leningrad region is not the periphery of Russia. It borders Finland. It sits adjacent to St. Petersburg, Russia's second largest city, and a center of significant political and cultural weight. Reaching that region with sustained consecutive strikes sends a message that extends beyond military utility. It communicates operational reach. It demonstrates that no logistics corridor, regardless of its distance from the contact line, can be treated as structurally immune. Several European security analysts have noted, and I want to represent this accurately as an open debate, not a settled conclusion, that this kind of geographic escalation carries dual implications. On one hand, it raises the cost-benefit calculation for Moscow of continuing the war indefinitely. On the other hand, it introduces complexity into the broader diplomatic environment, particularly regarding how far offensive operations into deep Russian territory can extend before triggering responses that neither Ukraine nor its partners have fully wargamed. That tension is real. It is acknowledged in Western policy circles, and it matters for what comes next. Because here is what the pattern across 2024 and 2025 tells us, and this is where historical observation becomes genuinely instructive. Ukraine did not arrive at the Leningrad region overnight. The targeting progression moves systematically from border-adjacent refineries to mid-depth logistics hubs to now facilities nearly 1,000 kilometers inside Russian territory. Each escalation step was treated as impossible until it happened. Then it became the new baseline. That trajectory does not suggest a ceiling has been reached. It suggests a doctrine in motion, and the country on the receiving end of that doctrine is facing a question its leadership has not answered publicly. At what point does the cost of defending everything outweigh the benefit of continuing anything? But before we assess Russia's position, there is a counter-argument that deserves serious engagement, because the strategic case for Ukraine's approach, compelling as it appears, has genuine vulnerabilities that its advocates tend to understate. Every compelling strategic narrative has a blind spot, and intellectual honesty demands that we locate Ukraine's. Let me be direct about what I am about to do. I am going to present the strongest version of the counter-argument, not to undermine Ukraine's position, but because understanding where a strategy is vulnerable is precisely how you assess whether it is sustainable. The first challenge is operational sustainability. Ukraine's ability to execute 3 consecutive long-range strikes within 4 days is operationally impressive by any measure. But the critical variable one that open-source analysis cannot fully resolve is the supply chain behind that capability. Long-range drone production requires components, materials, and manufacturing capacity that Ukraine has been scaling under wartime conditions. The rate at which Ukraine can sustain, replenish, and expand that arsenal is not publicly documented in sufficient detail to make confident projections. Historical patterns in asymmetric warfare are instructive here. Insurgent and defending forces have repeatedly demonstrated the capacity for spectacular operational moments, only to encounter sustainment ceilings that reset the strategic equation. This is not a prediction. It is a documented risk that serious analysts flag when evaluating any escalatory campaign that depends on high-tempo, resource-intensive operations. The second challenge is adaptive defense. Russia's air defense performance during these strikes revealed genuine gaps. That is confirmed by the evidence we have already examined. But military systems adapt. Following high-profile penetration events, defensive architectures are typically reassessed, reinforced, and restructured. There is no reasonable basis to assume that the specific vulnerabilities Ukraine exploited in late March 2026 will remain constant over subsequent months. The window of current operational effectiveness may be narrower than the momentum of these strikes suggests. The third challenge is the legal and normative dimension, and this one is frequently absent from mainstream coverage. A number of international legal scholars and humanitarian law analysts have raised questions carefully worded, not conclusive about the targeting of energy infrastructure that, while strategically connected to Russia's war economy, also serves civilian functions. This is not a simple question. Russia's energy export apparatus is deeply entangled with its military financing, but the normative debate about where that line sits is active in academic and policy circles, and it carries implications for the long-term legitimacy of Ukraine's international support coalition. Several European governments have been notably measured in their public commentary on deep strike operations. That measured tone is not accidental. It reflects genuine internal deliberation about escalation thresholds and the precedents being established for future conflicts, not just this one. The fourth challenge, and perhaps the most structurally significant, is the risk of miscalculation at the margins. Conflicts escalate not always through deliberate decision, but through the compounding of tactical actions that individually appear manageable. Each strike that reaches deeper into Russian territory compresses the space available for de-escalatory signaling. At some threshold, the precise location of which no analyst can identify in advance, the calculus for the party absorbing the strike shifts from strategic endurance to reactive escalation. This is not an argument for restraint as a moral position. It is an observation about system dynamics that the historical record consistently supports. The strategic case for Ukraine's targeting doctrine is analytically coherent, but coherent strategies encounter friction. They encounter resource ceilings, adaptive opponents, coalition fatigue, and the unpredictable variable of how a cornered adversary ultimately chooses to respond. None of these counter-arguments invalidate what Ukraine has achieved. They frame the conditions under which that achievement must now be sustained and extended. And that brings us to the dimension of this story that affects you most directly, regardless of where you stand on the geopolitics. Because what happens to those burning storage tanks on the Baltic coast does not stay on the Baltic coast. Let us close the distance between the Leningrad coast and your daily life, because there is a transmission mechanism here, a chain of economic causality that runs from a burning fuel storage terminal on the Baltic Sea directly into decisions that affect your cost of living. Understanding that mechanism is not alarmism. It is basic economic literacy applied to geopolitical reality. Start with the commodity layer. Primorsk and Ust-Luga are not marginal facilities. Together, according to energy market tracking data referenced by analysts monitoring Russian export flows, they handled a combined volume approaching 50 million tons of petroleum products in 2025. When both facilities experienced simultaneous operational disruption in the same week, the signal transmitted to global energy markets was not about the volume of oil lost in those specific days. It was about systemic vulnerability, the possibility that this disruption is not a single event, but a recurring operational pattern. Energy markets do not price only current supply. They price perceived future stability of supply corridors. That distinction matters enormously. When a major export node demonstrates fragility even temporarily, the risk premium embedded in global oil pricing adjusts. That adjustment is typically measured in dollars per barrel, and dollars per barrel translate through a well-documented chain of economic transmission into the price of fuel at every pump in every country that imports refined petroleum products. Think about what that means in practical terms. Higher fuel costs increase transportation expenses for every category of goods moving through supply chains: food, electronics, construction materials, industrial inputs. Every price tag in every market that depends on logistics, which is every market carries within it a component that is sensitive to energy price volatility. When that volatility increases, the embedded cost increases with it. This is what economists call cost push pressure. It does not require a supply shortage. It requires only sustained uncertainty about supply reliability. And that uncertainty is now structurally embedded in the Baltic energy corridor in a way that was not true 18 months ago. For economies in Asia, including economies like Vietnam that have expanded manufacturing export capacity significantly over the past decade, the transmission runs through two channels simultaneously. The direct channel is fuel and energy input costs for industrial production. The indirect channel is the behavior of global capital in response to elevated geopolitical risk premiums. When institutional investors recalibrate their risk assessments for supply chain exposure to conflict-adjacent regions, the cost of capital adjusts across emerging market economies. That adjustment appears in lending rates, in foreign direct investment calculations, and in the currency dynamics that determine import costs for everything from industrial machinery to consumer goods. Data from the International Energy Agency and the World Bank, examining periods of sustained energy infrastructure disruption since 2022, consistently shows that the lag between a geopolitical supply shock and its appearance in consumer price indices is typically between 6 and 14 weeks. It is not immediate. Let that mechanics sink in for a moment. The fires at Primorsk and Ust-Luga were extinguished by emergency crews within days, but the economic signal those fires sent into global pricing systems does not extinguish on the same timeline. It propagates, it compounds with other signals, and it eventually arrives quietly, without announcement in your monthly expenses. Inflation is not a news event. It is a delayed consequence of decisions made in rooms and on coastlines far removed from the moment you notice your purchasing power has quietly contracted. There is a deeper structural point here that most coverage entirely misses. The Baltic Energy Corridor is not simply a Russian export route. It is a node in a global energy pricing network that dozens of economies, including non-aligned economies with no direct stake in this conflict, depend upon for price stability. When that node experiences repeated, confirmed disruption, the network recalibrates around the instability. Supply routes shift. Insurance premiums for Baltic maritime shipping adjust. Contracts are renegotiated with new risk clauses embedded. Each of those adjustments has a cost. And that cost does not disappear into abstraction. It distributes itself unevenly, invisibly, but measurably across the global economy. You are not a bystander to what happened in the Leningrad region in late March 2026. You are a participant in its consequences. The only question now is whether the strategic decisions that follow on all sides of this conflict will compress or extend the duration of that economic pressure. And that question leads us directly to the most important unresolved variable in this entire story. Let us take stock of what we actually know. 3 things are now beyond reasonable dispute. Ukraine has demonstrated a sustained capacity for long-range precision operations against high-value energy infrastructure deep inside Russian territory. That capacity was confirmed not by Ukrainian claims, but by Russian officials themselves. Russia's air defense architecture, across 3 consecutive nights, failed to prevent operationally significant strikes on facilities that sit at the core of its energy export revenue. Its subsequent attempt to attribute those strikes to NATO involvement was formally and publicly rejected by the governments it named. And the economic consequences of that disruption, however, the fires are eventually extinguished and the facilities eventually repaired, have already entered the global pricing system. That process does not reverse on a political timeline. But here is what remains genuinely unresolved, and this is the question that will define the next phase of this conflict. If Ukraine can sustain and expand this targeting doctrine, at what point does the cumulative economic pressure force a strategic recalculation in Moscow? And critically, what does that recalculation look like? Negotiation, further escalation, something that neither side has yet publicly contemplated. No analyst can answer that with certainty today. Anyone who tells you otherwise is not analyzing, they are speculating. What I can tell you is that the answer will emerge from decisions being made right now, and when it does, this channel will be here to break it down with the same rigor you have seen today. Subscribe, because this story is not close to finished.